Greetings, everyone. I'm Gail Macinda. Very happy to be back with you after multiple lengthy recoveries from a variety of major health issues. And we're not quite done yet. A heartfelt thanks to all of you who have encouraged me along the way and sent prayers and well wishes. I truly appreciate it. I'm still a little self conscious about the changes in my speech, so please bear with me. But here's our story for today. Songs of faith typically express deeply held beliefs, or theology, and personal testimonies. By contrast, The Church in the Wildwood is a sweet, nostalgic poem set to music about a church building and its grounds, which the author describes in a fictional first-person narrative. Now, I have no problem at all with the fact that the story in the song is fictional. I just think it's important that we know that it is a fictional account. I've known people who are absolutely convinced that the story in this song happened exactly the way that it looks like it did in the song, but it didn't, at least not that way. So in our time together, we're going to try to sort out the sweet sentiment of the song from what really happened. The author and composer of this song, The Church in the Wildwood, is William S. Pitts. Pitts was born in New York State around 1830 and spent his childhood there, and notably took formal music lessons. In 1849, he moved to Wisconsin to become a school teacher. He met and fell in love with Anna Eliza Warren, a school teacher from Fredericksburg, Iowa. During an 1857 stagecoach trip to visit her, the stagecoach stopped for dinner and to get fresh horses in the nearby town of Bradford, Iowa. Taking advantage of the time to stretch his legs, Pitts took a walk and came upon a lovely scene of forest and pine and cedar trees. As he paused to take in the view, in his imagination he could see a church building there, a brown church building. When he got back home to Wisconsin, he wrote the poem and sometime later added the tune we know today as The Church in the Wildwood, or The Little Brown Church in the Vale. He simply wrote it for himself, not intending that anything would ever become of it, and put it away. He said he was compelled to write the song, and when it was completed, only then was I at peace with myself. Here's how the song begins. There's a church in the valley by the wildwood, no lovelier spot in the dale. No place is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale. Oh, come to the church in the wildwood, oh, come to the church in the dale. No spot is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale. And by the way, since vale, spelled V-A-L-E, isn't a word you hear much anymore, just so you know, it simply means a valley. You'll find it quite a bit in poetry of that era, just because it's a good one-syllable rhyming word, just like its rhyming synonym, dale. So, no, Pitts didn't remember this church from his childhood in New York. It was from his imagination while visiting in Iowa. Well, sometime later, he married that Iowa school teacher, and they began their married life together in Union, Wisconsin. In 1863, Mr. and Mrs. Pitts moved to Fredericksburg, Iowa, where her family still lived. And there, Mr. Pitts taught school and music in Bradford, Iowa, the town where he had first envisioned that little brown church. Imagine his astonishment to find that a church was actually being constructed on the very site that he had pictured 5 years earlier. Not only that, the story goes, the plan was to paint it brown. Now, we don't see a lot of brown buildings today, but if you have ever visited a historic site or recreated village, you might have noticed that many of those buildings are painted brown. Back in the day, brown really was a pretty common color for buildings, and you might wonder why. Well, some sources say it was cheaper, at least locally. Others say it was simply most readily available. Maybe the Civil War had something to do with supply and demand. I honestly don't know and couldn't find a documentable, provable answer. But if you know, please use the comment section down below to share your knowledge with all of us. I'd also appreciate it if you're enjoying the story to please do that like and subscribe stuff. It really does make a difference to help get the word out about History Heights stories, and I thank you. Construction on the church was slow due to the Civil War, and although it did take a few years to complete the building and have its wood properly protected by paint, in this case, brown paint, it was dedicated debt-free as a congregational church in December of 1864. Pitts introduced his song to the public for the first time in that church. The second verse goes, "How sweet on a clear Sabbath morning to list to the clear ringing bell. Its tones so sweetly are calling, oh, come to the church in the vale." Bells were commonly used to call people to worship or school or a meeting or even to sound alarms. And yes, this church has a bell, as did most churches of that era. The refrain begins with the words, "Oh, come, 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 come." Some say that that's suggestive of a church bell being rung, beckoning people to enter the church. Could be. But if you've ever rung a church bell or an old school bell, the kind on a rope, you know that it just doesn't go as fast as the song goes. In my imagination, I see people at the door of the church, inviting others to come in with a sweep of the hand. Come, come, just come on in. And this just might be a good place for the reminder that the most common reason people visit a church in the first place is because someone invited them. Just saying. The following year, Mr. Pitts made a big career change. He went to Chicago to study medicine. To help fund his education, he sold the rights to his song to Hiram Murray Higgins, a successful music publisher. As an aside, Higgins left Chicago and the music industry in 1871. That was the year of the Great Chicago Fire. He moved to California and gained some notoriety as a fruit farmer, specifically lemons. But back in 1865, he bought the right to the church in the Wildwood for $25, a little less than $500 in today's money. After graduating from medical school, the now Dr. Pitts returned to his home in Fredericksburg. Dr. and Mrs. Pitts made Fredericksburg their home until she passed away in 1886. There's a verse or a stanza in the poem, if you prefer, that goes like this. "There, close by the church in the valley, lies the one that I loved so well. She sleeps, sweetly sleeps, 'neath the willow. Disturb not her rest in the vale." So let's remember that this was written before Dr. and Mrs. Pitts were even married. And there isn't a cemetery at the church site. And Mrs. Pitts is buried in Fredericksburg. Dr. Pitts remarried, moved to Clarion, Iowa, and eventually to New York to live with his son. He died in 1918 and is buried in Fredericksburg next to his second wife. In the last two verses of the song, the text goes from an earthly body in a grave next to his beloved to happily going on to heaven. There, close by the side of that loved one, to trees where the wild flowers bloom, when the farewell hymn shall be chanted, I shall rest by her side in the tomb. From the church in the valley by the Wildwood, when day fades away into night, I would fain from the spot of my childhood wing my way to the mansions of light. As odd as this may seem, Pitts did not regularly attend the Little Brown Church. Dr. Pitts was a member of a Baptist church in Fredericksburg and joined congregational churches while living in Clarion and in New York. Even though Pitts had sold his song to a publisher, it didn't really catch on beyond the local congregation for quite some time. What really helped the song gain recognition was a group called the Weatherwax Brothers Quartet. They use it as their theme song beginning in the early 1900s. The Weatherwax Brothers were from Charles City, Iowa, about 15 miles away from the Little Brown Church, and they had visited there often and had met Dr. Pitts. These four brothers sang, but also played trumpets, 2 in B-flat and 2 in E-flat. Quite unusual then as well as now. This quartet was enormously popular. In the first 20 years of the 1900s, they traveled over 200,000 miles to perform throughout the United States and Canada, and they took their song with them wherever they went. They often performed for thousands at very large gatherings, even with the evangelist Billy Sunday during one of his campaigns that drew over 20,000 people in attendance. By early 20th century standards, the Weatherwax brothers had gone viral. Since then, the song had been performed and recorded many times, including the original Carter family, Charlie Pride, Alabama, Andy Griffith, Bill Gaither, so many more. But what about that church building? Well, the town of Bradford was once the county seat, but as often happened, when the expanding railroad didn't come to a town, the town declined, and that's what happened to Bradford. It wasn't long before the church was closed. And although members of the church continued to gather for worship at a local school, interest in the original church building remained very high. In 1914, services were resumed and continue to this day. The address is now listed as Nashua, Iowa. It truly is in a lovely location. I briefly visited the Little Brown Church on a lovely day in June of 2024. Since records have been kept, well over 70,000 weddings have taken place at the Little Brown Church. And the day that I was there were 3 weddings scheduled. The first wedding of the day was supposed to begin just a few minutes after we had arrived, but since the wedding had not yet started, the hostess, as she introduced herself, gave us a couple of moments to peek inside. But by then the organist was already playing the prelude, so we left. Lesson learned. If you plan on visiting, and I hope you do, give them a call first to check their schedule. We then took a short walk around the grounds. I thought about William Pitts and what had inspired him to write the poem about this place. William Pitts wrote his song from the perspective of an old man, reflecting on sweet memories and days gone by. Later in life, Pitts said, "My hope is that it will stand for 1,000 years and call the old man and his descendants to worship." We can learn from the past, but we don't live there. Go be awesome today. Make your own history. Stick around. Watch some more great stories like these.